It was supposed to be a quick stop at a small convenience store, a routine task before the day's heavy responsibilities resumed. The woman walked in confidently, her posture and demeanor reflecting someone who had earned respect in every step of her career. She moved through the aisles with quiet purpose, selecting a bottle of water and a snack for the long hours ahead. But what she didn't realize was that her very presence was about to trigger the ugliest side of someone's deeply rooted prejudice. As she approached the counter, the tension began to simmer. A uniformed officer, standing off to the side with a cup of coffee in hand, narrowed his eyes as he observed her. There was no logical reason for his suspicion, she had done nothing wrong, but his mind had already raced to conclusions. His face twisted into a condescending sneer as he stepped forward, blocking her path to the cashier. "Hold on," he said, his voice thick with authority and disdain. "What do you think you're doing here?" Her calm reply was measured but firm, just making a purchase like everyone else. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, his gaze sharp and invasive. "Funny, you don't look like you belong in a place like this. What are you really up to?" A chill ran through the air. Other customers began to notice, whispering among themselves, their curiosity mingled with unease. The woman placed her items on the counter and reached for her wallet, her tone unwavering. "If you'll excuse me, I have no intention of standing here and explaining myself to you." But the officer wasn't done. He leaned in, his voice lowering but losing none of its venom. "That's where you're wrong. People like you always think you can walk around, act like you own the place. But not here. Not on my watch." The humiliation was sharp, cutting through her like a blade. She drew in a slow breath, trying to keep her composure, but the weight of his words and the eyes of the room pressing down on her made it difficult. She tried again to de-escalate, her voice steady but with a hint of steel. "I don't know what you think I've done, but this is harassment, plain and simple." Harassment was an understatement. As she spoke, the officer's posture shifted, and before she could process what was happening, his hand gripped her arm with a force that made her flinch. He yanked her away from the counter, muttering about suspicious behavior and making an example. The room fell silent except for her sharp intake of breath and the sound of items clattering to the floor. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice rising. But her words were ignored as he dragged her toward the door, his grip tightening as though she were some kind of threat. "You have no right," she began, but her protest was cut off as he turned to face her, his anger bubbling over. "I have every right," he spat. "I'll decide who gets to walk free and who doesn't. You think you're better than me? That you can talk back to an officer of the law? Let me show you how wrong you are." What happened next stunned everyone. His hand moved to her neck, his grip firm as he pushed her against the wall near the entrance. The force made her head snap back, her vision blurring for a moment. Her breath caught in her throat as she struggled to process the sheer audacity of what was happening. And then came the words that would echo in her mind long after the incident: "You're nobody. Just another nobody trying to act like you're someone." The humiliation was suffocating, the injustice a weight on her chest that threatened to crush her. She knew she couldn't fight back, not here, not now, but she also knew this wasn't the end. As the officer released her with a shove, the room remained deathly silent. She stood there, trembling but unbroken, her mind racing with a single thought: he doesn't know who I am. But he will. The officer turned away, his swagger brimming with arrogance as he muttered to himself, another troublemaker dealt with. He never looked back as he exited the store, leaving behind a scene of stunned onlookers and one woman who had already begun planning her next move. Because this wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had been humiliated, disrespected, and dehumanized by people like him. What he didn't know, what no one in that store could have guessed, was that she wasn't just a regular customer. She wasn't someone he could reduce to nobody. And soon, the entire world would know it too. The next chapter in their story was already writing itself. What would happen when this officer, so sure of his power, discovered the truth about the woman he had demeaned? How would he react when the tables turned, and he became the one fighting to defend himself? This was no ordinary confrontation, and the fallout would be nothing short of extraordinary. Stay tuned to find out how justice is served in a way no one sees coming. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To our black viewers and all allies of equality, we want you to know that your voice matters, your story matters, and your presence is valued. This channel is a space where justice and truth take center stage. Thank you for being here, and we hope you enjoy this gripping story filled with powerful twists. If you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button to support our work. Let's dive into this impactful narrative. The morning sun cast long, golden shadows over the bustling streets of Atlanta. It was a city of contrasts, modern skyscrapers piercing the sky above streets steeped in history, where progress and tradition often seem to clash. For Captain Lila Foster, the tension between the past and the present wasn't just a backdrop, it was a part of her daily life. As the head of a specialized task force in the FBI, Lila's job wasn't just to uphold the law but to push against the invisible barriers that still dictated whose voices were heard and whose stories were erased. Lila was a woman who commanded attention, even in silence. At 42, her presence was one of quiet authority, honed through years of navigating a system that often underestimated her. Her deep brown skin, proud natural curls, and sharp, discerning eyes set her apart in rooms where she was often the only black woman, let alone one with her level of power. But it wasn't just her appearance, it was the way she carried herself, with a steady calm that belied the storms she had weathered. Her reputation in the Bureau was one of precision and determination, someone who rarely took no for an answer and never accepted less than what was right. She had worked tirelessly to earn her position, not just for herself but for the community she represented. Growing up in a modest neighborhood on Atlanta's South Side, Lila had seen firsthand the disparities that existed in the justice system. Her father, a retired teacher, and her mother, a nurse, had instilled in her the belief that education and perseverance could break through even the most stubborn walls of prejudice. Those lessons had carried her through law school and into the FBI, where she quickly rose through the ranks, despite the quiet skepticism of some of her colleagues. But beneath her composed exterior, Lila was no stranger to frustration and fatigue. The weight of being a symbol, the first black woman to lead her division, was both a badge of honor and an ever-present burden. She had become adept at swallowing her own anger, redirecting it into her work, and never letting her guard down in front of those who might exploit her vulnerability. Yet, in private moments, the walls she built to protect herself would crack, revealing a deep, unshakable weariness. On this particular morning, her day began like any other, with the kind of routine that belied the high stakes of her work. She sat at her kitchen table, sipping her coffee as she scanned through case files on her tablet. Her teenage son, Malcolm, was rushing out the door to catch the school bus, calling a quick goodbye over his shoulder. Malcolm was her anchor, the one thing that reminded her why she fought so hard. At 15, he was growing into a sharp, thoughtful young man, but Lila worried about the world he was stepping into. She had seen too many lives derailed by moments of unchecked bias and too many promising futures cut short by systemic failures. It was these fears that fueled her resolve, even when the odds felt insurmountable. The day's agenda was packed. Lila was leading an investigation into a high-profile corruption case involving city officials, a task that required navigating political landmines while keeping her team focused. She had always been meticulous in her work, knowing that any mistake could be weaponized against her. Her colleagues respected her, but she was acutely aware that respect was not the same as acceptance. There were still whispers behind closed doors, colleagues who questioned her authority, and others who simply resented her success. Meanwhile, Officer Ethan Caldwell's morning couldn't have been more different. Ethan was a man whose life was defined by control, both the illusion of it and his desperate need to maintain it. At 38, he had spent over a decade on the Atlanta Police Department, carving out a reputation for being tough but effective. To his superiors, Ethan was the kind of officer they valued, one who didn't hesitate to make arrests, often boasting about his high numbers in the precinct. But underneath the polished exterior of a dedicated officer was a man driven by anger and resentment. Ethan had grown up in a working-class suburb just outside the city, where his worldview had been shaped by a narrow lens of distrust and superiority. His father, a retired police sergeant, had often spoken about the good old days, when officers didn't have to second-guess themselves or worry about political correctness. Ethan had internalized those lessons, seeing himself as a protector of a way of life he believed was under threat. Over the years, his biases had hardened into an unshakable belief that certain people simply didn't belong in the spaces he patrolled. He justified his actions with a mixture of outdated rhetoric and a refusal to self-reflect. That morning, Ethan was stationed at a convenience store near the edge of downtown Atlanta, sipping his coffee and chatting with the cashier. It was a quiet assignment, one he found frustrating and beneath him. He preferred the adrenaline of high-speed chases and tense confrontations, moments that allowed him to assert his authority in ways that felt gratifying. But as the morning wore on, his restlessness turned to irritation, and irritation soon found a target. The paths of Lila and Ethan collided in that store, a place so ordinary it seemed an unlikely stage for the storm that was about to unfold. As Lila stepped inside, her focus was on the task at hand, oblivious to the scrutiny she had already drawn. Ethan's eyes locked on her immediately, his mind racing with assumptions that had no basis in reality but felt undeniable to him. The air grew thick with unspoken tension as their worlds intersected, setting the stage for a confrontation that would unravel more than either of them could have anticipated. Lila's life was a testament to resilience and purpose, while Ethan's was a reflection of fear and control masquerading as strength. Their clash wasn't just about the moment in the store, it was the culmination of two opposing forces shaped by the world around them. And though neither of them knew it yet, the events of that day would ripple far beyond the walls of the convenience store, leaving a trail of consequences that neither could escape. As the scene unfolded, the line between justice and vengeance blurred, raising questions that would linger long after the dust settled. The heavy hum of the convenience store's fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the tension that hung in the air. Lila stood near the counter, her calm exterior masking the rapid calculations running through her mind. Ethan, his badge catching the light as he shifted his weight, hovered nearby, his posture rigid and confrontational. The room felt smaller with every passing second, as if the walls themselves were closing in, pushing them toward an inevitable collision. Lila placed her items on the counter with deliberate movements, ignoring the weight of Ethan's gaze. She could feel it on her back, sharp and scrutinizing, but she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that any sign of vulnerability, no matter how small, could be twisted into an excuse for mistreatment. The cashier, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, avoided eye contact, his hands fumbling as he rang up her purchases. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You look nervous. Got something to hide?" Lila didn't turn around. Her voice, steady but firm, carried the weight of someone who was used to being challenged but never defeated. "Just buying a bottle of water and a granola bar. Is that a problem?" Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the space between them. "Depends. Some people come in here looking like they don't belong. Makes you wonder what they're really up to." Lila turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze over her shoulder. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held a quiet defiance. "And what exactly does belong look like to you?" The question hung in the air, daring him to answer. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hand twitching at his side as if reaching for authority he didn't need to use. He was used to being the one asking the questions, the one dictating the terms. The fact that she didn't cower or apologize only seemed to aggravate him further. The cashier cleared his throat nervously, his eyes darting between them. Ma'am, your total is $3.75. Lila reached into her bag, her movements deliberate. She could feel Ethan's suspicion growing with every second, his preconceived notions feeding a narrative he had already decided was true. As she handed over a crisp $5 bill, Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and laced with condescension. "You know, I've seen it all in this neighborhood. People thinking they can come in, act like they own the place, and then, bam, they're caught red-handed. Makes you think twice about who you trust." Lila exhaled slowly, her patience wearing thin. She turned fully to face him now, standing her ground as the tension between them crackled like a live wire. "I don't know what you think you've seen, but I suggest you keep your assumptions to yourself. I have no interest in playing whatever game you're trying to start." Ethan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, leaning into the role of the authority figure. "Game? You think this is a game? Let me tell you something. People like you think they can just walk in here and do whatever they want. But not on my watch." The phrase hit like a hammer, its weight pressing down on the room. Lila's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the urge to respond in kind. She knew the game too well, the way a single misplaced word or action could be twisted into justification for violence. Instead, she let silence speak for her, staring at him with an intensity that made even the cashier pause. Ethan took her silence as defiance. His tone grew sharper, more accusatory. "What's in the bag? You seem awfully protective of it." Lila raised an eyebrow, incredulous. "A laptop. Is that a crime now?" "Let's see it," Ethan demanded, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a couple of customers lingering in the aisles. Lila's voice was cold, cutting through the mounting noise. "No, you won't. I don't owe you an explanation, and you don't have probable cause." Ethan's smirk returned, but this time it carried an edge of desperation. "Probable cause? Look at you, talking like you're some kind of lawyer. What, you think you're better than me? Smarter than me?" Lila's response was measured, her tone sharp enough to cut through his bravado. "I don't think. I know." The words landed with a force that seemed to echo in the small space. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like it could shatter with a single breath. Ethan's face darkened, his hand moving to his radio as if preparing to escalate the situation further. The cashier, sensing the brewing storm, tried to intervene. Officer, maybe we should stay out of it," Ethan snapped, his voice sharp enough to silence the young man mid-sentence. Ethan's focus snapped back to Lila, his expression a mixture of anger and frustration. He took another step forward, his presence now looming over her. "You think you can just walk in here, act like you're untouchable? You don't know who you're messing with." Lila met his gaze without flinching, her voice calm but laced with steel. "No, Officer Caldwell. You don't know who you're messing with." The use of his name stopped him in his tracks. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, as though he was beginning to realize that the situation wasn't as simple as he thought. But before he could respond, the door of the store opened, and another customer walked in, breaking the moment. Ethan stepped back slightly, his confidence wavering but not broken. Lila turned back to the counter, collected her change, and walked toward the door without another word. But as she reached for the handle, Ethan's voice followed her, loud and condescending. "Don't think this is over." Lila paused, her hand on the door, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she let the weight of his words hang in the air before stepping out into the sunlight. Behind her, the tension in the store lingered, a storm that had only just begun to brew. Outside, Lila's mind raced, not with fear but with purpose. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ethan had no idea what he had started, but soon enough, he would. And when the truth came to light, it wouldn't just be a reckoning for him. It would be a reckoning for every assumption, every bias, and every abuse of power that he thought would go unchecked. As the door of the store swung shut behind her, a small, knowing smile played at the corners of her lips. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The tension in the FBI conference room was palpable, every sound amplified in the silence. The soft rustling of papers, the faint hum of the projector, the steady ticking of a clock on the wall, all of it underscored the gravity of the moment. Lila sat at the head of the table, her presence commanding and unyielding. Around her, a select group of agents reviewed the evidence laid out before them, their expressions a mix of disbelief and resolve. The investigation into Officer Ethan Caldwell had progressed rapidly after Lila's encounter at the convenience store. Her decision to take action wasn't just personal, it was necessary. Ethan's behavior wasn't an isolated incident but part of a pattern of abuse, one that had remained hidden behind a facade of authority and trust. With the resources at her disposal, Lila had uncovered complaints, disciplinary records, and, most damning of all, videos. Videos that captured Ethan's blatant misuse of power, his unchecked aggression, and his deep-seated prejudice. The footage from the convenience store, captured by the store's security cameras, was the centerpiece of their case. It showed everything, the way he had confronted her, the escalating hostility, the moment he grabbed her by the arm, and the look on his face when she stood her ground. The team had played the clip over and over, each viewing solidifying their understanding of who Ethan truly was. One of the agents, a younger man named Daniels, broke the silence. "It's all here. The excessive force complaints, the forged reports, the pattern of targeting people based on their race. And now, this." He gestured to the screen, where the paused footage of Ethan's confrontation with Lila loomed large. "This is undeniable." Lila nodded, her voice calm but firm. "This is more than just a case against one officer. This is about accountability. It's about making it clear that no one, no matter their badge or title, is above the law." Another agent, a seasoned investigator named Collins, leaned forward, his expression grave. "He's not going to take this lying down. Someone like Caldwell doesn't just admit defeat. He's going to fight this tooth and nail." Lila's eyes narrowed, her resolve hardening. "Let him fight. The truth is on our side, and the evidence speaks for itself." As the meeting concluded, Lila stayed behind, staring at the now dark screen. The confrontation with Ethan had been a stark reminder of the battles she faced, both as a black woman in law enforcement and as someone committed to justice in a system that often resisted change. But this wasn't about her alone. This was about every person who had been silenced, every victim who had been denied justice, and every future encounter that could end in tragedy if people like Ethan were allowed to continue unchecked. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan was sitting in his squad car, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. He had heard whispers of an internal investigation but dismissed them as nothing more than bureaucratic noise. He was confident in his ability to navigate the system, to bend it to his will as he always had. After all, he had been untouchable for years, his actions shielded by a combination of camaraderie and complacency within the department. His radio crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. It was a call to the precinct, urgent and direct. He sighed, annoyed at the disruption, and made his way back, the weight of the day settling on him. When he arrived, the atmosphere was different. The usual chatter and movement were subdued, replaced by a sense of quiet anticipation. Something was happening. The precinct captain, a stern woman named Rodriguez, was waiting for him in her office. Her expression was unreadable, her posture rigid. Ethan entered, his usual confidence faltering slightly as he noticed the folder on her desk, its contents partially visible. He recognized the still image from the convenience store footage and felt a chill run down his spine. Rodriguez's voice was steady, her words deliberate. "Officer Caldwell, we need to talk." Ethan tried to play it cool, leaning against the doorframe. "What's this about, Captain?" She gestured to the chair in front of her desk, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Sit." Reluctantly, Ethan complied, his mind racing. Rodriguez opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents before meeting his gaze. "We've received a formal complaint, supported by substantial evidence, regarding your conduct during an incident last week. Specifically, your interaction with a civilian at a convenience store." Ethan scoffed, leaning back in his chair. You've got to be kidding me. That was nothing. Just doing my job, keeping the peace. Rodriguez's expression hardened. Your job does not include harassment, excessive force, or abusing your authority. The evidence we have tells a very different story. Ethan's confidence wavered, but he quickly tried to regain control. Come on, Captain. You know how it is out there. People don't respect the badge anymore. Sometimes you have to show them who's in charge. Rodriguez's voice grew colder. Show them who's in charge. Is that what you think this is about? This isn't the first complaint we've received about you, Caldwell, but it's the first time we've had irrefutable proof. Do you have any idea who that civilian was? Ethan's brow furrowed, confusion and unease flickering across his face. What are you talking about? Rodriguez leaned forward, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. That woman you manhandled. She's not just some random person. She's Captain Lila Foster, head of an FBI task force, and she's the one leading the investigation into you. She has the power to dismantle your career with a single phone call. The color drained from Ethan's face as the weight of her words sank in. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Rodriguez didn't give him a chance to recover. You're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately, pending the outcome of this investigation. Turn in your badge and your gun. Ethan's hands trembled as he unfastened his badge, placing it on the desk with a hollow clink. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but the walls were closing in, and there was no escape. As he walked out of the office, the eyes of his colleagues followed him, their expressions a mix of pity and disdain. For the first time in his career, Ethan felt powerless, the very authority he had wielded so carelessly now stripped away. And though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of his reckoning. Ethan sat in the small, dimly lit interrogation room at the FBI field office, the cold steel of the chair pressing against his back. His hands rested on the table, fingers twitching as if searching for something to hold on to. The weight of his suspended badge and gun, now surrendered, felt like a ghost pulling him down. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of a fluorescent bulb overhead. He wasn't used to being on this side of the table. The unease clawed at him, but he refused to let it show. The door opened, and Lila stepped inside, her presence commanding but measured. She didn't slam the door or stride in with dramatic flair. She didn't need to. Her quiet authority filled the space like a rising tide. She carried a thin folder, the same one he'd seen on Captain Rodriguez's desk. Without a word, she sat across from him, placing the folder deliberately on the table. Ethan's instinct was to speak first, to try to reclaim control of the situation. This is some kind of joke, right? I mean, what are we even doing here? Lila's gaze locked onto his, unflinching. Her voice, calm and steady, carried an edge that cut through his bravado. Do you think this is a joke, Officer Caldwell? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks a lot more serious than that. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as if to shield himself. All this over some misunderstanding at a convenience store. You're blowing things way out of proportion. I was just doing my job. Lila tilted her head slightly, studying him like a puzzle she'd already solved but was piecing together for her own satisfaction. Your job. Harassment, profiling, and physical intimidation are part of your job description. Ethan's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but you don't know what it's like out there. People don't respect the badge anymore. They challenge you at every turn, and sometimes you have to remind them who's in charge. Lila's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands folding neatly on the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was colder now, each word deliberate. Remind them who's in charge. That's how you justify it. Not just with me but with everyone you've targeted over the years. People whose lives you disrupted because you felt threatened by their existence. Ethan's face flushed, and he leaned forward, his voice defensive and desperate. "I don't target anyone. I've spent years on the force protecting this city, dealing with criminals, cleaning up the streets. Maybe if you stepped out of your cushy office and into the real world, you'd see how things actually work." Lila didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her voice unwavering. "I've spent my entire career dealing with the real world, Officer Caldwell. The difference is, I've done it without letting fear and prejudice dictate my actions." Ethan's defenses began to crack, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wanted to fight back, to push against the accusations, but the evidence in the folder sat like a ticking bomb between them. His voice wavered, a mixture of anger and desperation. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through or why I do what I do." Lila leaned in now, her calm exterior giving way to something sharper, more personal. "You're right. I don't know you. But I know the consequences of men like you. I know the fear you instill in people who have done nothing wrong, the damage you leave behind because you think your badge gives you the right to play judge, jury, and executioner." Ethan looked away, his eyes flickering to the folder. "This is ridiculous. I've done my job the best I could. Nobody's perfect." Lila opened the folder, pulling out a single photograph and sliding it across the table. It was a still from the convenience store footage, showing the exact moment he had grabbed her arm. She placed her finger on the image, her voice softer now but no less piercing. "Does this look like doing your job to you? Does this look like protecting and serving?" Ethan stared at the photo, his silence louder than any argument he could muster. Lila continued, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't about one bad day or one bad decision. This is about a pattern, a legacy of abuse and unchecked power. You think you're protecting something, but all you're doing is tearing it down." He clenched his fists, his voice low and bitter. "You've already made up your mind about me, haven't you? You're just here to watch me squirm." Lila's expression softened, but only slightly. "This isn't about watching you squirm, Ethan. This is about accountability. About making sure the next person you target doesn't have to carry the weight of your choices." The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to choke on. Ethan's walls were crumbling, but he wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. He looked up at her, his voice tinged with something close to vulnerability. "And what happens now? You're just going to ruin my life? Take everything I've worked for?" Lila's gaze softened, though her resolve remained firm. "You ruined your own life, Ethan. The choices you made, the people you hurt, those were your decisions. This isn't about taking something from you. It's about ensuring that no one else has to pay the price for your actions." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the truth. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. He had spent his life building an image of himself as the protector, the enforcer, the one who kept order in a chaotic world. But now, faced with the consequences of that image, he saw it for what it truly was, a fragile construct built on fear and control. Lila stood, gathering the folder and tucking it under her arm. She looked down at him, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't the end for you, Ethan. What happens next is up to you. You can choose to fight the truth, to deny what's in front of you, or you can take a hard look at yourself and figure out what kind of man you want to be." She turned to leave, her footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Ethan didn't stop her, didn't call out or try to defend himself further. He was left alone with the weight of her words, the evidence in front of him, and the realization that the reckoning he had feared was no longer something he could avoid. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving him to face the silence, and himself. Ethan sat in his small apartment, the sound of the city filtering through the cracked window. The once orderly space, decorated with reminders of a life spent in service to the badge, now felt suffocating. His police commendations, framed photographs from precinct events, and a collection of neatly stacked case files seemed to mock him. They represented a version of himself he no longer recognized, a man who had believed, without question, that his actions were justified. Now, every plaque and certificate felt hollow, a reminder of the truth he could no longer ignore. He replayed the conversation with Lila in his head, her words cutting deeper each time. Accountability. Responsibility. Those concepts had once been tools he wielded against others, shaping their lives and futures without a second thought. But now, the tables had turned, and he was the one under scrutiny. The evidence against him was undeniable, and no amount of denial or bravado could erase what had been captured on tape. The footage of that day at the convenience store wasn't just a record of his actions, it was a mirror reflecting the man he had become. The precinct had gone quiet since his suspension. His phone, once buzzing with messages and calls from colleagues, now sat silent on the kitchen counter. The isolation was deafening, forcing him to confront thoughts he'd spent years burying. What was it that drove him to act the way he had? Was it the frustration of the job, the stress of feeling like the city was slipping further into chaos, or something deeper and darker, a fear he had never allowed himself to name? Across town, Lila was in her office, reviewing the latest developments in the case. The evidence had been compiled, and the investigation was nearing its conclusion. The task force had uncovered even more troubling details about Ethan's history on the force, false reports, aggressive arrests, and a troubling pattern of targeting minority communities. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Ethan wasn't just a rogue officer, he was a symptom of a larger problem within the department. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the board in front of her. It was covered in photographs, timelines, and documents, each piece connected by lines of red string. Ethan's face sat in the center, a stark reminder of the man whose actions had ignited this investigation. But as Lila stared at his image, she felt something unexpected: empathy. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but a glimmer of understanding. Ethan was a product of a system that had failed everyone involved. A system that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked and had left countless victims in its wake. Lila's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. Collins stepped inside, his expression serious but not unkind. "We've finalized the report," he said, placing a thick folder on her desk. "The evidence is solid. It's time to move forward." She nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder. "And Caldwell?" Collins hesitated, then sighed. "He's not fighting it. At least, not yet. He's been quiet since the suspension. No appeals, no public statements. It's like he's waiting for the hammer to fall." Lila closed the folder, her decision made. "Then we make sure it falls the right way. This isn't just about him, Collins. This is about sending a message, to the department, to the city, to everyone watching. We're not just taking down one man. We're holding an entire system accountable." Meanwhile, Ethan found himself walking the streets of Atlanta, his steps aimless and heavy. He avoided the places he used to frequent, the bars where off-duty officers gathered and the coffee shop where the barista knew his name. Instead, he wandered into unfamiliar neighborhoods, areas he had once dismissed as dangerous or unworthy of his time. He passed by murals painted on crumbling brick walls, vibrant scenes of community and resilience that stood in stark contrast to the narratives he had built in his mind. At one point, he stopped outside a community center, drawn by the sound of laughter and conversation. Through the windows, he saw children playing and adults gathered in discussion, their faces lit with hope and determination. He couldn't remember the last time he had looked at these neighborhoods and seen anything other than statistics and suspicion. For the first time, he wondered how much of that perspective had been shaped by his own biases, his own fear of losing control. The next day, Ethan received a summons to the precinct. He knew what it meant, but the finality of it still hit him like a punch to the gut. When he arrived, the atmosphere was tense, the whispers of his former colleagues following him like shadows. Rodriguez was waiting for him in her office, her expression unreadable. She handed him a formal letter, detailing the terms of his termination and the charges he was likely to face. Her words were measured but firm, each one landing with the weight of inevitability. "This isn't just about you, Caldwell," she said, her tone devoid of malice but also of sympathy. "This is about setting a precedent. We can't afford to let this kind of behavior slide anymore." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to respond. He left the precinct for the last time, the badge and uniform that had once defined him now stripped away. He was no longer Officer Caldwell, the enforcer of rules and order. He was just Ethan, a man who had to figure out what came next. Lila watched the news coverage that evening, the headlines announcing Ethan's dismissal and the charges he would face. Public reaction was mixed, some hailed it as a long overdue step toward justice, while others decried it as an attack on law enforcement. But for Lila, it wasn't about the headlines or the opinions. It was about the quiet victories, the steps toward a system that didn't just punish wrongdoing but actively worked to prevent it. As the city buzzed with debate and discussion, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the letter of termination crumpled on the table in front of him. He stared at the walls, at the symbols of his former life, and wondered if there was a way to rebuild. He didn't know what redemption looked like or if it was even possible. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to sit with the discomfort, to face the man he had become and the choices that had brought him here. Across the city, Lila stood on her balcony, the lights of Atlanta stretching out before her. The battle wasn't over, she knew that. There would be more cases, more challenges, and more moments that tested her resolve. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The system wasn't perfect, and neither was the world she fought to protect. But with each step, each decision, she was shaping something better, something stronger. Ethan's story wasn't finished, and neither was hers. The consequences of their actions would ripple outward, touching lives they might never see. And in the spaces between those ripples, there was hope, not for perfection but for progress. The morning light filtered through Ethan's apartment, casting long shadows across the floor. The place felt empty, devoid of the sense of purpose it had once carried. His uniform was gone, packed away in a box he had shoved into the back of his closet. The badge he had worn with pride now felt like a relic from a past life, a symbol of authority that he'd clung to, even as it eroded the person he thought he was. He sat at the table, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of him, his mind replaying the events of the past weeks. The investigation, the suspension, the termination, it all seemed surreal, like a story unfolding around someone else. But the weight in his chest reminded him that this was his reality now. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of who would be standing on the other side. Opening it, he found Captain Rodriguez, her presence as commanding as ever. She wasn't wearing her usual uniform but instead a plain blazer, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy between them. Finally, she broke it, her tone measured but firm. "Can I come in?" Ethan stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room. Rodriguez entered, her gaze sweeping over the space, taking in the scattered papers, the half-empty coffee mug, and the faint smell of regret that seemed to linger in the air. She sat down on the worn couch, waiting for Ethan to join her. When he did, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and spoke with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. "I'm not here to lecture you, Caldwell. You've had enough of that already. But there are some things we need to talk about." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, the tension in his shoulders palpable. "I don't think there's much left to say. You made your point loud and clear." Rodriguez's eyes narrowed, her tone sharpening just slightly. "This isn't about making a point. It's about figuring out what happens next. You might be done with the badge, but you're not done with the consequences of your actions." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think I don't know that? Every day, it's all I think about. The mistakes I've made, the people I've hurt, it's like a tape that won't stop playing in my head." Rodriguez leaned back, studying him carefully. "Good. You should think about it. But thinking isn't enough. If you want to move forward, you need to do something about it. Ethan looked at her, his frustration bubbling to the surface. What do you expect me to do? Apologize? Stand on a street corner holding a sign that says I'm sorry? It doesn't matter what I do. People have already made up their minds about me. Rodriguez's voice softened, but her words were no less pointed. It's not about what people think of you, Caldwell. It's about what you do with the truth you've been forced to face. You spent years hiding behind that badge, convincing yourself that you were the good guy, that your actions were justified. Now you have a choice to make. Are you going to keep running from the truth, or are you going to own it? Ethan didn't respond right away, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. The truth was a heavy thing, and carrying it felt like an impossible burden. But there was a part of him, a small, flickering ember of something resembling hope, that wondered if she was right. The conversation lingered in his mind as the days stretched into weeks. He began to venture out more, not to escape his thoughts but to confront them. He walked through neighborhoods he had once patrolled with suspicion, seeing them through new eyes. He volunteered at a local community center, at first just to stay busy, but eventually finding himself drawn to the stories of the people there. They were parents and children, teachers and students, people trying to make a life for themselves in a world that often seemed stacked against them. Listening to them, Ethan began to understand the depth of the harm he had caused, not just through his actions but through his indifference. One afternoon, as he helped set up for a youth basketball game at the community center, he saw Lila standing near the entrance. Her presence was as striking as ever, her posture straight and her expression calm but observant. She had been invited to speak to the kids about leadership and perseverance, but when she saw Ethan, she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. He approached her cautiously, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Captain Foster," he began, his voice hesitant. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." She raised an eyebrow, her tone neutral. "I could say the same about you." Ethan nodded, looking down at the floor for a moment before meeting her gaze. "I've been volunteering here. Trying to. I don't know, do something meaningful, I guess." Lila studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured. "Meaningful isn't a destination, Caldwell. It's a process. You don't get to erase the past by doing a few good deeds." "I know that," he said quickly, his tone earnest. "I'm not trying to erase anything. I need to make things right. Or at least try." Lila crossed her arms, her gaze never wavering. "Making things right means facing the people you've hurt, the communities you've damaged. It means being honest, not just with them but with yourself." Ethan swallowed hard, her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "I don't even know where to start." Lila's expression softened, just slightly. "You start by listening. By understanding that this isn't about you. It's about the people who've been living with the consequences of your choices." The conversation stayed with him long after Lila left. He began attending community meetings, not as an officer or an enforcer but as a listener. He heard stories of pain and resilience, of families torn apart by systemic failures and individuals fighting to build something better. Slowly, he began to understand the depth of the harm he had been a part of, and the magnitude of the work it would take to even begin repairing it. Through it all, Lila kept her distance, observing his efforts from afar. She wasn't quick to trust, and she wasn't interested in redemption stories that ended in hollow apologies. But as she watched Ethan confront his past and engage with the people he had once dismissed, she saw a glimmer of something she hadn't expected: growth. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all that was needed to begin building something better. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the community center as Ethan stood in the corner of the gymnasium, watching the kids play basketball. Their laughter and shouts echoed off the walls, a sharp contrast to the quiet turmoil that churned inside him. The weeks of volunteering had been humbling. Every interaction reminded him of the lives he had once judged so harshly, of the faces he had dismissed as troublemakers or threats. He still wasn't sure if his presence here was welcomed, or if people merely tolerated him out of politeness. Either way, he kept showing up, hoping that his actions would one day speak louder than his past. Lila entered the gym quietly, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She hadn't come to see him, at least not intentionally, but when their gazes met across the room, there was a flicker of recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement of the complicated path that had brought them both here. She made her way over, her posture straight and her expression calm but unreadable. Ethan straightened instinctively, a faint shadow of his old habit of standing at attention in the presence of authority. "I see you're still here," Lila said, her tone neutral but edged with curiosity. Ethan nodded, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Figured it's better than sitting at home doing nothing." "Is it?" she asked, her eyebrows lifting slightly. "Or are you just trying to convince yourself you're doing enough?" Her words stung, but they also forced him to confront a truth he hadn't fully admitted. He hesitated before replying, his voice quieter. "I don't know what enough looks like. I don't even know if it's possible." Lila's gaze softened, though her tone remained firm. "It's not about enough. It's about accountability. It's about showing up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when people don't forgive you." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes dropping to the floor. "And what if they never do? What if I can't fix this?" Lila's voice carried a quiet strength as she responded. "You're not here to fix it. You're here to take responsibility. Forgiveness isn't something you earn on your timeline. It's something people choose to give, if and when they're ready." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. "I'm trying," he said after a long pause. "I don't know if it matters, but I am." Lila tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Trying is a start. But it's not the end. If you're serious about this, you need to stop waiting for validation and keep doing the work, no matter how hard it gets." The conversation hung between them, heavy and unresolved. Lila's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen, her expression shifting. "I have to go." "But, Caldwell," she paused, her voice softening just slightly. "Don't waste this opportunity." Ethan watched her leave, her words echoing in his mind. Don't waste this opportunity. He wasn't entirely sure what the opportunity was, redemption, change, or something else entirely, but he knew he couldn't walk away from it. That evening, Ethan attended a community meeting, as he had been doing regularly. The room was filled with familiar faces, people who had come to expect his quiet presence in the back. This time, however, he felt a pull to speak. As the discussion wound down and the facilitator asked if anyone had closing thoughts, Ethan raised his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. When the room quieted, he stood, his voice hesitant but determined. I don't really know how to say this. But I feel like I need to." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who had every reason to hate him. "I've made a lot of mistakes. More than I can count. And I've hurt people in this room, people in this community. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to take responsibility for it. And I want to learn how to be better, how to do better." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't hostile. It was contemplative, filled with the weight of his words and the emotions they stirred. One by one, people began to speak, not to absolve him, but to share their experiences. They talked about the fear they had felt, the anger, and the pain. They didn't sugarcoat their stories, and Ethan didn't expect them to. He listened, absorbing every word, letting it settle in the spaces he had once filled with excuses and justifications. When the meeting ended, an older woman approached him, her expression wary but not unkind. "You've got a long way to go, son," she said, her voice steady. "But showing up like this? It's a start." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. As the weeks passed, Ethan continued to immerse himself in the community, not as a savior or a penitent seeking redemption, but as someone learning to listen and understand. He volunteered, attended events, and engaged in difficult conversations. Each day was a challenge, a reminder of the harm he had caused and the work still ahead. But it was also a reminder of the resilience and strength of the people around him, people who had every reason to turn him away but chose instead to hold him accountable in ways that were both painful and healing. Lila kept tabs on his progress, not out of obligation but out of a cautious curiosity. She saw the changes, the way he carried himself with less arrogance and more humility. She saw the way the community began to respond, not with open arms, but with a grudging acknowledgement that he was trying. It wasn't a redemption arc or a clean resolution, but it was real. And for Lila, that was enough. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Ethan found himself standing outside the community center, staring at the mural painted on its walls. It depicted a vibrant scene of unity and strength, a stark contrast to the divisions he had once perpetuated. He reached out, his fingers brushing the painted bricks, and felt a flicker of hope, not for an easy resolution, but for the possibility of change. Months later, the landscape of Ethan's life had changed completely. He was no longer defined by his badge or his past missteps but by the choices he made each day to rebuild. The community center had become his second home, a place where he worked quietly, side by side with people he once viewed with suspicion. His efforts hadn't gone unnoticed, but they hadn't been met with instant acceptance either. Forgiveness, he had learned, wasn't something to be demanded, it was a gift, one earned over time through consistency and accountability. One day, Ethan found himself in a packed auditorium at the annual community summit, an event he had once ignored but now understood deeply. He wasn't scheduled to speak, and he hadn't planned to. He was there to listen, to observe, and to learn. But as the facilitator opened the floor for reflections, a voice from the back called his name. The room fell silent, every eye turning toward him. The facilitator gestured for him to take the mic, and though his heart pounded in his chest, Ethan rose from his seat. Standing before the crowd, he felt the weight of their expectations and their skepticism. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't have a prepared speech," he began, "because I didn't come here expecting to speak. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes the most important thing you can do is show up, even when it's uncomfortable." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "I've done things I'm not proud of. I've hurt people, made assumptions, and acted in ways that went against the values I thought I stood for. And for that, I'm sorry. I know that saying those words doesn't fix anything, but I hope that through my actions, I can show you that I'm committed to doing better. Not for praise or redemption, but because it's the right thing to do." The room was quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Ethan handed the mic back and returned to his seat, his heart still racing. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was genuine, a quiet acknowledgement that he was trying. For Ethan, it was enough. For Lila, the months following the investigation had been a whirlwind of progress and setbacks. Ethan's case had sparked a larger conversation about accountability within law enforcement, leading to new policies and training programs aimed at addressing systemic bias. It was a step forward, but not a solution. As she stood in her office late one evening, reviewing reports and updates, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about Ethan, about the journey he had embarked on, and about the countless others whose stories didn't have the chance to change. It was a reminder of why she fought so hard, why she never stopped pushing. Weeks later, Lila and Ethan crossed paths again at a community event. It wasn't planned, but when their eyes met across the room, there was a quiet understanding between them. They walked toward each other, the air between them no longer charged with tension but with mutual respect. Lila spoke first, her tone measured but sincere. "You've come a long way, Caldwell." Ethan nodded, his voice steady but humble. "I still have a long way to go. But thank you, for everything." She offered a small smile, her expression softening. Keep showing up. That's how change happens. Ethan nodded again, the weight of her words settling into his chest. As she walked away, he felt a sense of closure, not because his journey was complete, but because he finally understood what it meant to take responsibility, not just for his actions but for the impact they had on others. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the community center, where the mural on the wall now included a new addition, a depiction of people standing together, hands joined, with the words, "Strength through Unity," painted above. He stared at it for a long time, the message sinking in. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, not one defined by power or authority, but by connection and accountability. This story isn't just about Ethan or Lila. It's about the choices we make, the systems we uphold, and the courage it takes to confront uncomfortable truths. It's about understanding that change doesn't happen overnight, but through consistent, often painful effort. It's about acknowledging that while we can't undo the past, we can shape the future by showing up, listening, and doing the work. Now it's your turn to reflect. What would you do if you were in Ethan's position, faced with the weight of your own mistakes? What does accountability look like to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we want to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful narratives like this, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit the like button, share this video, and join our growing community. Together, we can explore stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power of change. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.